folks, my name is John Lee and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to continue discussing the movie Ode to My Father. Now the last time we talked about the human collateral in the form of coal miners and nurses who went to West Germany in order to earn foreign currency for the South Korean government. Today we're going to proceed with Toksu's next adventure when he worked as a private contractor in South Vietnam in 1974. Now, it is often said that war is a tragedy, but we should be a bit clearer about that. War is indeed a tragedy, but it is only usually a tragedy for those who are directly affected by it. For those who are not directly affected by the war, and provided that they don't really have a lot of scruples to begin with, war usually tends to be a very lucrative business opportunity. It always has been, and it always will be. The Korean War was a disaster and a tragedy for the Korean people. And hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives and untold amounts of money was lost in that war. But because of the Korean War, the Japanese economy got a much needed boost. Similarly, the Vietnam War was a tragedy for the Vietnamese people. But it was an economic opportunity that the South Koreans could not pass up. It's important to note the timing of Toksu's role in South Vietnam. Firstly, it's because the movie got it wrong, and secondly, it might be possible that the movie got it wrong in order for the movie to avoid some rather uncomfortable historical truths. In reality, South Korea's involvement in the war was from 1965 to 1973, a full year before the events in the movie take place. So, why the discrepancy? Now, in the previous video when we talked about his time in West Germany, he was there from 1963 to 1966. And assuming that he was in his mid-20s at the time, he was already working in West Germany by the time the South Korean government decided to get involved in the Vietnam War. And so, by 1974, Toksu was presumably in his mid-30s, which means that he would have been too old to have served in the army by that time. And that was probably done in order to help Toksu avoid getting tarnished. Now, tarnished is a rather strong word, and I'm going to have to explain as to why I chose that word. But in order to do so, we are going to have to talk about the Vietnam War just a little bit. Now, the Vietnam War lasted about 20 years, from 1955 to 1975. And it's important to remember that initially South Korea volunteered to send troops as early as 1955. But the South Vietnamese government did not feel that it was necessary for South Korean troops to deploy. So, South Korea never sent the troops until much later. But by 1964, the US President, Lyndon Johnson, was quite eager to get more allied nations on board. Obviously, by having more allies, it would have helped the United States to reduce its economic burden. But not only that, by having more allies involved in the war, it would have also helped to legitimize the American involvement in that war and to also at least show on paper the solidarity of the free world. Of America's allies, South Korea sent the most number of troops. Between 1965 to 1973, about 350,000 South Korean troops were deployed to that country. There were quite a few reasons as to why South Korea sent so many of its troops to South Vietnam. Firstly, South Koreans felt a debt of gratitude to the US. After all, during the Korean War, the United States helped the South Korea to fend off against the North Korean aggression. And because the United States was now helping the South Vietnamese fend off against North Vietnamese aggression, the South Koreans felt that it was time to pay back. It was also in order to show the rest of the world that South Korea was no longer just a helpless country that only relied on the United States for its survival. By deploying so many of its troops to fight the communists in South Vietnam, the South Korean government was able to show the world that South Korea was not a pushover country anymore. But those were just the ideological reasons. There were also more practical and less altruistic reasons as to why South Korea sent so many troops. Firstly, by sending that many troops to South Vietnam, the South Korean government was able to curry favor with Washington. So, next time in the future, whenever South Korea needed something, it would always be able to get a more sympathetic ear from Washington. But that was a slightly less tangible benefit. A much more tangible benefit was that South Korea got paid rather handsomely for deploying that many troops to South Vietnam. Before the South Korean government agreed to deploy its combat troops to South Vietnam, it had three main demands. The first demand was that South Korean troops' wages were to be paid for by the US government. The second demand was that the United States would help to modernize the South Korean military. And the third demand was that while South Korean troops were deployed in South Vietnam, the United States would continue to maintain their force numbers in South Korea, so that the United States forces in South Korea would continue to serve as a significant force that could still help to defend South Korea from North Korean aggression. President Lyndon Johnson agreed to all of these demands. For South Korea, this deal was about as good as things were going to get. So what kind of soldiers did the South Korean government send to South Vietnam? In short, the answer was the best of the best. And that's because at the time the South Korean government insisted on maintaining a policy of sending only volunteers to fight in that war. And there was no shortage of volunteers who went to South Vietnam. And the main reason for that was the incredible pay gap between the South Korean troops who were stationed in Vietnam and the South Korean troops who were stationed within South Korea. According to declassified documents from the United States Department of Defense, a typical South Korean soldier who was stationed in Vietnam was paid around 37 American dollars per month. Now, $37 might not seem like that much amount of money, but a South Korean soldier who was stationed in South Korea was paid less than $2 a month. As there was no shortage of volunteers, the South Korean government was able to send the cream of the crop. And for better or for worse, the South Korean troops who were sent to South Vietnam were very effective at their jobs. The fact that South Korean troops were paid by the United States government was a huge boon for the South Korean government. In the last video, I mentioned that the South Korean government had a hard time procuring foreign currency because it was just so poor and it didn't have a lot of collateral. Well, in this case, the South Korean soldiers were paid by the United States government in American dollars. This was a huge infusion of foreign currency that the South Korean government would not have gotten otherwise. For a country that was as cash-strapped as South Korea was in the 1960s, this was the answer to their prayers. So how much did the US government end up spending on the South Korean troops? Well, according to a US congressional report called the Fraser Report that came out in 1977, the US government spent a total of about $1 billion for the South Korean troops. But unfortunately for the South Korean soldiers, they themselves did not actually see all of that money. And that's because according to the agreement that was signed between the South Korean and the United States governments, the agreement stipulated that the US government would not pay the money directly to the soldiers, but would pay the money to the South Korean government. Once the South Korean government got that money, it would pay its own soldiers at a significantly lower rate. Now, $1 billion sounds like a lot of money. But if the US had deployed its own troops as opposed to deploying South Korean troops, it would have had to have spent a lot more than $1 billion. But that being said, $1 billion at the time was still 4% of the American economy's GNP. For South Korea, this was a significant amount of money that it could not pass up. According to that same congressional report that I mentioned earlier, of that $1 billion that the US paid for, about $925 million entered into the South Korean economy's foreign exchange reserves. No other American ally was able to get as much benefits as the South Korean government did. And so this caused quite a bit of annoyance by some in the US government. At the time, there was a US senator from Arkansas by the name of James William Fulbright, and he often referred to the South Korean troops as mercenaries. Now, it was insulting, and his characterization of South Korean troops as mercenaries was not entirely accurate, but it wasn't all that wrong either. However, it wasn't just the deployment of military troops that helped the South Korean government to earn money. By deploying troops to South Vietnam, it also gave a huge opportunity to South Korean private construction firms. These firms were given a lot of military contracts in order to help rebuild infrastructure in South Vietnam. The initial wave of South Korean troops that were sent to South Vietnam were not combat troops. The initial wave consisted of mostly mechanics, engineers, and medics. They were collectively known as the Dove Force, and when the Dove Force first arrived in South Vietnam, they brought with them about 100,000 civilian contractors. The Vietnam War provided a new opportunity to South Korean businesses. It was the very first time that South Korean businesses were able to go abroad in order to seek very lucrative and profitable construction work. These South Korean private construction firms were professional and also, to be honest, compared to construction companies from other countries, were a lot cheaper. And so, coupled with the Dove Force, the initial wave of South Koreans who first came to South Vietnam were very much welcomed. It is precisely because of this positivity that is associated with private contract workers that Toksu was made into that, a contract worker. If he had been a South Korean soldier instead, his hand would have definitely been caked with blood. And let's face it, Toksu is, yes, an ordinary person, but he's not just a person. Toksu is a symbol. He's supposed to symbolize the entire South Korean government, the entire South Korean state. Had Toksu been a soldier, this would not have been a feel-good movie. Now, as I've said earlier, the South Korean troops who were deployed in South Vietnam were an important component that helped to improve the South Korean economy. But unlike the private contractors, the South Korean soldiers had a slightly more ambiguous involvement in that war. Now, in the next video, I want to talk about the South Korean military's involvement in the Vietnam War itself. But before I do that, I do want to go back to this entire timing issue. Now, I just spent the past few minutes explaining that the reason why Toksu was made into a private contractor was so that he would not have blood on his hands, and that is true. But that still doesn't excuse the fact that the movie got the timing so incredibly wrong. Now, in the movie, Toksu makes his first appearance in South Vietnam in 1974. But that's not possible. And the reason for that was that the Paris Peace Accords, which had formally helped to end the Vietnam War, stipulated that all foreign troops deployed in Vietnam were to be withdrawn by 1973. And so, by 1974, it would not have been possible for Toksu to have been there. But in the movie, not only does Toksu make his first appearance in South Vietnam in 1974, apparently there were also American troops that were still stationed there at the time. And not only that, South Korean troops were stationed in Vietnam until the fall of Saigon in 1975. None of that was actually possible. Alright, but that's the military. Toksu was not a soldier, he was a private contractor. So it's entirely possible that Toksu could have been there in 1974, right? No, that wasn't possible either. And that's because although the military had withdrawn from Vietnam in 1973, the private contractors had withdrawn a full year earlier in 1972. We have to remember that by the early 1970s, things were already getting visibly bad for the Allies. When South Korea first deployed its troops to South Vietnam, it composed of about 10% of all international troops in the country. But toward the end of the war in the early 1970s, South Korean troops composed of about 60% of international troops. The private contractors who were in South Vietnam were already able to see the writing on the wall, and they knew that the war was over. And so even before the last South Korean troops left, the South Korean contractors left earlier. In the real world, by 1974, South Korean construction firms had already long abandoned South Vietnam and were seeking new markets in the Middle East, mostly in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. That's because in 1973, Israel and several Arab nations had went to war in what is now known as the Yom Kippur War. A number of Western nations at the time supported Israel against the Arab nations, and in retaliation for supporting Israel, OPEC began an oil embargo. This oil embargo caused the price of oil to skyrocket. At the time, a barrel of oil cost about $3, but once the oil embargo hit, a barrel of oil began to cost about $12. Now, eventually, those Arab nations would lose to Israel in that war, and it was a humiliating defeat. But the humiliation of that defeat notwithstanding, the huge spike in the price of oil meant that it was economic boom times for those Arab nations, and they wasted no time in getting to improve the economies and the infrastructure. South Korean construction firms were not going to let that opportunity go to waste and remain in South Vietnam when they knew that the war was coming to a very unfavorable end for them. Ode to My Father was meant to be a historical film, but frankly, the researchers who were hired to make this film historically accurate, well, they dropped the ball. Okay, as I said, in the next chapter, I want to discuss a bit more about the South Korean military's involvement in the war. But for now, I think this is a good place to stop this video. Okay, so if you like this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell. And you know the drill. If you've got any comments, leave it down below. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.